Every morning at exactly 6:15, the little bell above Rosie's diner chimed and Maya Brooks looked up from wiping down the counter to see her favorite customer shuffle through the door. The old white woman with silver hair always wore the same worn purple coat and sat in the corner booth by the window, where the first rays of sunshine touched the cracked vinyl seats. Maya never knew that this woman held the key to a secret that would change everything she thought she knew about herself. She never knew that the gentle soul who always ordered black coffee and toast was searching for something precious she had lost 22 years ago. What Maya didn't know was that in exactly 7 days, 4 bodyguards in black suits and a team of lawyers would walk through that same door, and her life would explode into something she never imagined possible. But right now, in this quiet moment before the chaos, she simply smiled and poured the coffee just the way the old woman liked it. The woman's hands trembled as she wrapped her weathered fingers around the warm cup, and when she looked up at Maya, there were tears glistening in her pale blue eyes that made Maya's heart squeeze tight in her chest. Maya had been working at Rosie's diner for 3 years, ever since her mother got sick and she had to drop out of Jefferson State University, where she was studying business. She remembered the day she walked into the dean's office and said she couldn't continue because her mama needed her and the money for treatment was more important than any degree. Her mother, Clara, had raised her alone in their tiny apartment on the south side of the city, and Maya never knew her father because her mama said he left them before Maya was even born. Clara worked 3 jobs to give Maya everything she could, and when the cancer came, it ate through their savings faster than fire through dry wood. Maya watched her beautiful, strong mother fade away over 18 terrible months, until finally 2 years ago, Clara took her last breath holding Maya's hand. The funeral was small and quiet because they didn't have much family, and the few friends who came brought casseroles and kind words, but nobody could fill the giant hole that Mama's death left behind. Now Maya lived in a single room above the hardware store where the radiator clanked, and the walls were so thin she could hear Mrs. Chun next door coughing through the night. She worked double shifts at the diner, saving every penny she could because deep down, she dreamed of going back to school someday and finishing what she started. The old woman, whose name was Mrs. Helen Montgomery, but who insisted Maya just call her Helen, came to the diner every single morning and always sat in that same corner booth. At first, Maya thought she was just another lonely soul looking for a warm place and a kind face, but there was something different about the way Helen watched her. Sometimes Maya would turn around from the coffee pot and catch Helen staring at her with an expression so full of longing and sadness that it made Maya want to cry. Helen never ordered much, just coffee and dry toast, sometimes with a little grape jelly, but she always stayed for exactly 2 hours, reading the newspaper and watching the morning light change colors on the worn linoleum floor. She left a $5 tip every time, which was generous considering her bill was usually only $3, and Maya always tried to give some back. But Helen would close Maya's fingers around the money and whisper that she wanted her to have it. There was something about Helen's voice that reminded Maya of wind chimes on a summer porch, and sometimes, when Helen spoke, Maya felt a strange flutter in her chest like a bird trapped behind her ribs trying to get free. One Tuesday morning, when the diner was especially quiet because a storm had rolled through the night before, Helen reached across the table and touched Maya's hand. Her fingers were cold and thin like bird bones, and they shook slightly as she held on tight. Maya could see Helen's eyes were red from crying, and there were dark circles underneath that spoke of sleepless nights. Helen opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again, and Maya watched a tear slide down the old woman's cheek and drop onto the scratched Formica table. Maya sat down across from her, which she wasn't supposed to do during her shift, but her boss Jerry was in the back, and besides, nobody told Maya Brooks not to comfort someone who was hurting. She squeezed Helen's hand and asked what was wrong, and Helen just shook her head and whispered that sometimes the weight of the past was almost too heavy to carry. She said she had been looking for something for so many years, and just when she thought she might have found it, she was afraid to reach out and touch it, because what if she was wrong, and what if reaching for happiness only brought more pain? Maya didn't understand what Helen meant, but she held the old woman's hand until the shaking stopped and told her that hope was worth holding on to, even when everything else slipped away. What Maya didn't know was that Helen Montgomery was one of the wealthiest women in America. She didn't know that Helen's late husband had built a shipping empire that stretched across 3 continents and was now worth over $3 billion. She didn't know that Helen lived in a mansion with 26 rooms on the north side of the city, where old money lived behind iron gates and manicured hedges. She didn't know that Helen had a son named James who died 23 years ago in a car accident, and that James had been secretly married to a young black woman named Clara Brooks. Helen didn't know about the marriage until after James died, when she found a wedding certificate hidden in his apartment along with photographs of him and Clara smiling at each other with a love so bright it hurt to look at. By the time Helen found out about Clara, the young woman had disappeared, and Helen's husband Richard was so consumed by grief over losing James that he refused to even acknowledge Clara's existence. Richard said it was probably just some girl looking for money, and that James had been too young to know what he was doing. But Helen saw the truth in those photographs, and she knew her son had loved Clara with his whole heart. For 22 years Helen searched for Clara. She hired private investigators and spent millions tracking down every lead, but Clara had changed her name and moved cities and vanished like smoke. Helen's husband Richard died 10 years ago, still bitter and angry at the world for taking his only son, and Helen continued the search alone. She never remarried because her heart belonged to the family she never got to meet, and every night she prayed that somewhere out there she had a grandchild who carried James's smile and his kind heart. Then 6 months ago, Helen's lead investigator finally found Clara's trail, but the news he brought made Helen's world crumble all over again. Clara had died 2 years earlier from cancer, and she had a daughter named Maya who was 22 years old and working as a waitress at a place called Rosie's Diner. The investigator showed Helen photographs of Maya, and when Helen saw the young woman's face, she gasped, because it was like looking at James when he was young. Maya had his eyes the same warm brown with gold flecks, and she had his smile that crooked way. The left side went up higher than the right. Helen knew without any doubt that this was her granddaughter, her flesh and blood, the last piece of James that still walked this earth. But Helen was terrified. She was 70 years old, and she had spent 2 decades searching, but now that she had found Maya, she didn't know what to do. How do you walk up to someone and tell them their entire life story was based on a lie? How do you explain that the father they thought abandoned them actually died before they were born and never knew they existed? Helen knew that Clara must have thought James left her and probably spent her whole life believing she had been betrayed by the man she loved. The thought of how much pain Clara must have carried made Helen weep into her pillow at night. So Helen did the only thing she could think of, which was to go to the diner every morning and watch Maya from afar. She studied every gesture, every smile, every moment of kindness Maya showed to customers, and with each passing day, Helen fell more in love with this granddaughter who didn't know she existed. Maya was everything Helen had hoped for. She was kind and hardworking, and there was a light in her eyes that refused to be dimmed, even though life had been cruel. Helen wanted to throw her arms around Maya and tell her everything, but fear kept her frozen in that corner booth day after day. The breaking point came on a cold Friday morning when Helen overheard Maya talking to another waitress named Susan. Maya was saying how her landlord was raising the rent, and she didn't know how she was going to afford it because her hours at the diner had been cut and she was already working at a second job cleaning offices at night. Susan asked if Maya had any family who could help, and Maya's face went sad and distant. And she said her mama was gone, and she never had any other family because her daddy left before she was born. She said sometimes she felt so alone in the world that it was like being a ghost floating through other people's lives, but never quite being real. Helen felt something break inside her chest when she heard those words, and she knew she couldn't wait any longer. That night she called her lawyer David Chun and her head of security Marcus Williams and told them it was time. She said she had found her granddaughter and she was going to tell Maya the truth, no matter how scary it was, because Maya deserved to know she wasn't alone in this world. Monday morning came and Maya arrived at Rosie's diner at 5:30, like always, to start the coffee and set up for the breakfast rush. She tied her apron around her waist and was pulling out the sugar containers when she heard the bell above the door chime. She looked up expecting to see Roy, the mailman who always came early for his coffee, but instead, she saw 4 men in black suits walk through the door. They were big men with earpieces and serious faces, and they spread out across the diner like they were securing a crime scene. Maya's heart started pounding because she thought maybe the diner was being robbed, but then a 5th person walked through the door. And it was Helen. But this wasn't the Helen that Maya knew. This Helen was wearing an expensive black coat and diamond earrings that caught the fluorescent lights, and behind her came 3 more people in business suits, carrying briefcases. Maya stood frozen behind the counter, her hands gripping the edge so tight, her knuckles turned white, and she watched as Helen walked slowly toward her with tears streaming down her face. Helen stopped a few feet away, and for a long moment, nobody said anything. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the old clock on the wall. Then Helen spoke, and her voice was shaking so badly, Maya could barely understand the words. She said, "Maya, I need to tell you something, and it's going to sound impossible, but every word is true, and I have proof and lawyers and DNA tests if you need them, but please just listen with an open heart." Maya nodded because she couldn't find her voice, and Helen continued. "She said your father's name was James Montgomery, and he was my son, and he loved your mother Clara with his whole heart and soul. He didn't abandon you, Maya. He died in a car accident 2 months before you were born, and he never knew Clara was pregnant. Your mother must have thought he left her, but he didn't. He was coming home to her when his car was hit by a drunk driver, and he died instantly." Helen's voice broke, and she had to stop and wipe her eyes before she could go on. She said, "I've been searching for you for 22 years, and when I finally found you 6 months ago, I was so afraid to tell you the truth because I didn't want to hurt you, but I can't stay silent anymore because you're my granddaughter, and I love you, and you deserve to know who you really are." Maya felt like the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. She grabbed the counter to steady herself and stared at Helen, trying to make sense of the words that didn't seem real. Her father hadn't abandoned them. He had died. He had loved them. He had been coming home. All those years her mother had carried the weight of thinking she'd been betrayed, when the truth was so different, so tragic. Maya felt anger rise up hot and fierce, because why hadn't anyone told her? Mama, why had Clara died thinking she'd been left alone? But then she looked at Helen's face and saw the same pain reflected there, and she understood that Helen had been searching, had been trying, had spent 2 decades looking for them. The lawyer stepped forward, and his name was David, and he had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He opened his briefcase and pulled out documents: the wedding certificate with her parents' names, photographs of a young man who looked so much like Maya it was startling, her mother's smiling face pressed against his. There were hospital records and death certificates, and police reports about the accident, and finally, there was a DNA test that proved beyond doubt that Maya Brooks was the biological granddaughter of Helen Montgomery. Maya's hands shook as she looked through the papers, and when she saw the photographs of her parents, so young and so in love, something inside her cracked open. She started to cry, not gentle tears, but great gulping sobs that came from deep in her chest, where she had been holding grief and loneliness for so long. Helen moved forward and wrapped her arms around Maya and held her tight while Maya cried into her shoulder. Helen was crying too, and she kept whispering, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I didn't find you sooner," and Maya clung to her and thought about how many mornings this old woman had sat in that corner booth, watching her and wanting to speak but being too afraid. All those $5 tips, all that kindness, it had been Helen trying to take care of her, the only way she knew how. Jerry came out from the kitchen and saw what was happening. And he just stood there with his spatula in his hand looking confused, but he didn't say anything because even Jerry could see this was something bigger than the breakfast rush. David the lawyer cleared his throat and said there was more that Maya needed to know. He explained that James Montgomery had been the only child of Helen and Richard Montgomery, and that their estate was worth over $3 billion. Because James was gone, and Maya was his only child, that made Maya the sole heir to everything: the houses, the businesses, the investments, all of it. He said there were trust funds and properties, and a seat on the board of Montgomery Shipping International, if she wanted it. The numbers were so big, Maya couldn't even wrap her mind around them, because yesterday she was worried about making rent, and today she was being told she was a billionaire. But none of that mattered, not really, because what mattered was sitting in that diner with her arms around a grandmother she never knew she hadn't, feeling for the first time since her mother died that she belonged to someone. Helen pulled back and cupped Maya's face in her hands and said, "You don't have to decide anything right now about the money or the business. We can figure all that out later. But what I want you to know is that you have a home with me if you want it, and you have a family, and you are loved more than you can possibly imagine." The next few weeks were like living in a dream that Maya kept thinking she would wake up from. Helen insisted Maya move into the mansion, which was so big Maya got lost trying to find the kitchen on her second day. There were maids and cooks and gardeners, and Marcus, the head of security, who looked scary but turned out to have a soft spot for old movies and would watch classic films with Maya in the mansion's private theater. Helen gave Maya her own suite of rooms with a bedroom bigger than her entire old apartment and a bathroom with a tub so huge Maya could swim in it. But the best part was the library, where Helen and Maya would sit for hours looking through photo albums of James. Helen told stories about Maya's father, how he loved to read poetry, and how he volunteered at the children's hospital, and how he played guitar badly but enthusiastically. Maya learned that she got her stubbornness from her father and her kind heart too, and with every story she felt like she was getting back a piece of herself she never knew was missing. But it wasn't all easy, because grief has a way of circling back when you least expect it. Maya would be laughing at something, Helen said, and then suddenly she would think about her mother and how Clara never got to know this happiness, never got to know that James loved her and didn't leave. One night Maya broke down crying and told Helen how angry she was that her mother died believing a lie, and Helen held her and cried too, and said she was angry about that too, and that some injustices in life can never be made right. We can only try to honor the people we lost by living fully and loving deeply. They decided together to set up a foundation in Clara's name to help single mothers get medical care and education, because that's what Clara would have wanted. Maya threw herself into the work and found that helping others helped heal the raw places in her own heart. Helen introduced Maya to the board of Montgomery Shipping, and while some of the old men in suits were skeptical of this young black woman who had appeared out of nowhere, Maya proved herself quickly. She remembered everything she had learned in her 2 years of business school, and she had ideas that were fresh and innovative, because she understood what it meant to struggle and to dream. She proposed programs to help employees go back to school, and better healthcare benefits and profit sharing, and slowly the skeptical board members became her biggest supporters. Helen watched with pride as Maya transformed from a scared young woman into a confident leader who was going to take the Montgomery Empire into the future while never forgetting where she came from. 6 months after that life-changing morning, at Rosie's diner, Maya stood in front of a crowd of reporters and cameras. Helen was beside her, and so was David the lawyer and Marcus, and the whole team of people who had become her new family. Maya was announcing the Clara Brooks Foundation and a $50 million commitment to helping single mothers and their children. She wore a beautiful blue dress that Helen had bought her, but around her neck was her mother's old locket, the one Clara had worn every day of her life. Maya spoke clearly and strongly about her mother's courage, and about how one woman working 3 jobs had raised a daughter who dreamed big dreams. She talked about her father, who she never got to meet, but who she carried in her heart through the stories Helen told. She said family wasn't just about blood, it was about showing up and caring, and being there through the hard times and the good. She said her grandmother had shown her that it's never too late for love to find you, and that sometimes the people who look like strangers might actually be angels, waiting to reveal themselves. After the press conference, Maya and Helen went back to the mansion and kicked off their shoes and made tea in the big kitchen, just the two of them. They sat at the counter where Maya had sat that first awkward night, and Helen asked if Maya was happy. Maya thought about it, really thought about it, and then she smiled and said yes. She was happy, but it was a different kind of happiness than she expected. It wasn't about the money or the big house or the fancy clothes. It was about belonging and being known and having someone who loved her just because she existed. She said she missed her mother every single day, and sometimes the grief still knocked her down, but now when she fell, there was someone to help her back up. Helen reached across and took Maya's hand the same way she had done that morning in the diner, and said that was all she ever wanted for Maya, to know she wasn't alone. That night, Maya stood at the window of her bedroom, looking out over the gardens where lights twinkled in the trees like captured stars. She thought about the girl she had been just months ago, living in that tiny room above the hardware store, thinking she was all alone in the world. She thought about her mother and hoped somehow Clara knew the truth now, that James had loved her and that their daughter was safe and cared for. She thought about her father, who she would never meet, but who she felt connected to through every story and every photograph. And she thought about Helen, who had searched for 22 years and never gave up hope. Maya realized that life was full of impossible things, that sometimes the universe conspired to bring people together who were meant to find each other. She realized that every morning she had served Helen coffee, she had been serving her own grandmother, and that love had been there all along, just waiting to be recognized. The next morning, Maya woke early from habit, and for just a moment she forgot where she was. Then she remembered and smiled and put on jeans and a sweatshirt and went downstairs. Helen was already in the kitchen making coffee, and when she saw Maya, she beamed and asked if she wanted toast with grape jelly. Maya laughed and said yes, and they sat together at the counter in that big quiet house and watched the sun come up through the windows. It was just like those mornings at Rosie's diner, except now they both knew the truth and could say the words that had been trapped for so long. Helen reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind Maya's ear and said, "Good morning, my darling." Granddaughter and Maya leaned into the touch and whispered, "Good morning, Grandma," and felt her heart swell so big she thought it might burst. They had lost so much time, and there was grief that would never fully heal, but they had found each other, and that was everything. A year passed, and Maya finished her business degree at Jefferson State University, this time walking across the stage to get her diploma with Helen sitting in the front row cheering louder than anyone else. Maya had insisted on completing what she started because her mother had always told her that education was something nobody could ever take away from you. She balanced school with her work at the foundation and her responsibilities at Montgomery Shipping, and sometimes she was so tired she could barely see straight, but she kept going because that's what Clara had taught her to do. On graduation day, Maya wore her cap and gown and carried 2 photographs in her pocket, one of her mother and one of her father, and when they called her name she walked across that stage, knowing both her parents would have been proud. After the ceremony, Helen threw a party at the mansion and invited everyone who had been part of Maya's journey, including Jerry from the diner and Susan, the waitress, and even Mrs. Chun from the apartment building, who cried and said she always knew Maya was special. Maya also made sure to stay connected to her roots because she never wanted to forget where she came from. Every Tuesday morning she went back to Rosie's diner and worked a shift alongside Jerry and the crew, and she always sat in that corner booth during her break and remembered the woman who used to sit there watching her with eyes full of love and secrets. She used part of her inheritance to buy the building that housed the diner so Jerry wouldn't have to worry about rent increases, and she set up a scholarship fund for children of service workers so they could go to college without the burden Maya had carried. Helen supported every decision Maya made and told her that James would have been so proud of the woman his daughter had become, and that Clara's spirit lived on in every kind thing Maya did for others. The Clara Brooks Foundation grew into something bigger than Maya had ever imagined, with clinics and schools and job training programs in 12 cities across the country. Maya hired people who understood struggle, people who had been where she had been and who knew what it meant to need help, but also to need dignity and respect. She gave speeches at universities and conferences, and every time she told her story about being a waitress who found her grandmother and discovered she was an heir to a fortune, but more importantly, discovered she was loved, people would come up to her afterward with tears in their eyes and tell her their own stories of loss and hope and finding family in unexpected places, and Maya would hug them and tell them to never give up because miracles happen when you least expect them. Maya thought about how her life had changed in ways she never could have imagined, and she understood that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as ordinary moments, like an old woman sitting in a diner drinking coffee and watching and waiting and hoping that one day she would find the courage to say the words that would change everything. And Maya knew that she would spend the rest of her life honoring her mother's memory and her father's love and building something beautiful with the grandmother who never stopped searching and who proved that family and hope and love can survive anything, even 22 years of loss and longing and separation. Every morning when Maya woke up in that big beautiful house, she whispered a prayer of thanks for the long journey that brought her home and for the truth that set them all free.